Before we begin talking about classical Greek art and architecture, I want to briefly mention music. Music was very important in the drama of the Greeks. And remember, if you will dial back a few days, depending on how long it's been since you've been working in this unit, when we talked about early Greece, we talked about the doctrine of ethos, and that was simply the Greek belief that music influenced character. And we talked about two modes of music then, and I want to add a third now. We talked about the Dorian mode being the warlike music, the Phrygian mode being the more emotional, love type music, and I want to introduce this last one to you, which is more plaintive, pathetic, sad. All of these were important modes that worked within this concept of the doctrine of ethos. Now, since we've just finished talking about the philosophers, I did want to mention briefly that music was very important to Plato and Aristotle. For Plato, he believed that musical activity molded character. He believed and bought into the doctrine of ethos. So in his ideal world, right, certain music was necessarily banned because it would make you act in a less than virtuous way. Plato also believed that the musical scale reflected the proportions of the cosmos. And this actually comes from Pythagoras. So that music for Plato was something that linked the real and the ideal worlds. Aristotle, not surprisingly, had a bit more practical view of music. He believed that musicians could compose works that imitated and reflected the highest state of reason and thus were virtuous. So again, you see the differences in their philosophies. Plato being, let's look beyond this world for understanding, versus Aristotle, let's look here on this world for understanding, come through in their different ideas about music. But let's go ahead now and turn and look at some classical Greek sculpture. Sculpture of this period was concerned with order and balance. And we know that the Critios boy marked the transition between early and classical sculpture. Now I want to look at sculptures from two artists during the classical period. Myron and Polykleitos. They strove for naturalism and tried to create an ideal form in the terms of Plato, the best, the most perfect, and specifically the ideal form as it relates to proportion, to balance, and to symmetry. This is one of Polykleitos' most important works, and it's called the Doryphoros, or for us, the Spear Bearer. This is actually a reproduction. The original is lost, but we know what he designed it to look like from his writings. Polykleitos actually devised a mathematical formula for representing the perfect male body. And he wrote this down in a work that he called the Canon. For him, ideal beauty consisted of a precise relationship between various parts of the body. So there was a certain proportions that the finger had to have to the hand, and the hand to the arm, and so on and so forth. And he created the Doryphoros to demonstrate this theory. And so here you see ideal beauty produced by reason. Plato would have been very proud. This is Myron's The Discus Thrower. And Myron was one of the most famous Greek sculptors. And this work was considered by many to be the perfect male athletic form. You have the strength and vigor, you've got realistic action, you've got a very true representation of a person, and again, striving for Plato's ideal form. So you can see, this is the Critios boy, that turning point between ancient Greek sculpture and classical Greek sculpture. And then the height of classical Greek sculpture here with these works. Architecture, not surprisingly, was also concerned with proportion and interrelationships between various parts of the structure. I want us to look at a couple of the major 5th century architectural achievements. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia and the Acropolis at Athens. The Parthenon, the Propylaea, and the Erechtheum are the 3 buildings that we need to look at. Now, don't forget that this building project at Athens, this Acropolis project, is one of the things that led to the Peloponnesian War. Because remember, Athens was taking money from the Delian League, from Thebes and Sparta and Corinth, to help finance this massive building project. But let's look first at the Temple of Zeus. This is the largest Doric temple on mainland Greece. And the distance from the center of one column to the center of the next column is the unit of measure for the entire building. It's very ordered, it's very balanced. Indeed, if you drew a line down the center of the Temple of Zeus, you would have an exact mirror image on each side. And not surprisingly, the decorative frieze up here is a tribute and a celebration to reason. And this is a picture of what's on the west pediment. You have Apollo, the god of reason, stopping a fight with one finger, not with force. This is a depiction of a wedding party. The centaurs, and you can see parts of them, get drunk and try to abduct the bride. But here comes Apollo to the rescue and ends the fight, not with brute force, but with reason. Something the Greeks would have highly, highly valued. Now, let's look at some of the main buildings of the Acropolis. This is an aerial view as it sits on a high hill in Athens. It was a fortified citadel and a state sanctuary. And it is believed to be the supreme expression of balance and proportion, order and reason. It was built and designed by a very famous architect named Pericles. This is the Parthenon. This was the first building of the Acropolis to be built, and it was considered the most important and most characteristic monument of classical Greece. It was built as a temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the patron of Athens. It's very mathematically precise. You have Doric columns that are 34 feet tall that tilt slightly up, so that at 2 miles they would touch one another. You have 17 columns on each side and 8 across the front and the back. It's made of marble. They did add a frieze or decorative sculpture around the top in order to prevent heaviness or monotony. And there are 2 pediments. One is over the main entrance, which the sculpture there shows the birth of Athena, and the one over the back entrance, the fight between Athena and Poseidon over the name of the city. As an interesting note, in the 19th century, the British ambassador to Constantinople stole the sculpture on the frieze and pediments and sold them to the British Museum. So, it's quite interesting. The Propylaea, and this is what's left of it, was finished in 432, the year the Peloponnesian War began. And it's actually the entrance to the Acropolis. You have Doric columns on the front and back, and Ionic columns on the insides. It's kind of hard to see from this picture. And again, this is just another explanation of the differences between the Doric order and the Ionic order. And finally, the Erechtheum. And it is an Ionic building, if you can see from the columns here. And it honored numerous gods. The challenge was that it was built on very uneven ground. So what they did was put entrances on different levels. It was divided into two main sections of worship, one for Athena and one for Poseidon. This is one of the most well-known features of the Erechtheum, and it's called the Porch of the Maiden. Here the roof rests on female statues and not columns. They're standing with one leg slightly bent as if they're holding up the building, and they're very classically dressed.